everyone, welcome back to Build. I'm your host, Brittany Jones-Cooper. DeRay Mckesson is a civil rights activist and community organizer who became a household name after his participation in and documentation of the Ferguson protests. His advocacy for victims of police violence, leadership in the Black Lives Matter movement, and hopes for the future of America are all captured in his new book, On the Other Side of Freedom. Please put your hands together for DeRay Mckesson.
It's good to be here. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and welcome. You know, I've been watching you over the last 4 or so years, and just it's really great to really get inside your head a little bit with this book.
Oh, thank you.
So you've been on a journey. What does it feel like to actually see this in print?
It's sort of wild, you know, I spend so much time writing on Twitter, so it can like, you know, if I don't like it, I just delete it or like something like that. This is like, you have it, you know, like you have my story, you know about my mother, you know about how I think about my identity, you know how we process thinking about the police, like you have it. So that is sort of like a weird thing that it's like, it's there, it's done, it's no longer just mine.
Yeah. And obviously we know a lot about your activism, but as you mentioned, you do open up about your personal life as well. So what was the decision making behind that? Why did you feel like that was important for you to share?
Yeah, it's like we show up in the fullness of who we are in the work. So I needed to talk, you know, it's a huge deal. My mother left when I was 3 and came back when I was 30. And I process that every single day. That means something to me. And I wanted to write about that and what that means from how I think about memory in the work. I write about being gay. It's the first time I've ever written like a long form piece about being gay. I'm not in the closet, haven't been in the closet, but I've just never written about it. So those things were important as like personal stories that help flesh out like how I think about the world.
I think it was really powerful in the book when you actually reference a gay man during the civil rights movement in the 60s.
Yeah,
and how he said the only way you can hurt the movement is if you're secretive about who you are. And I thought that was really powerful because you do sort of see the progress in that way and that you can, the intersectionality of it and how important that is.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that intersectionality is not just about intersecting identities, it's about intersecting systems of oppression, right? And that is an important note. It's one of the reasons why I felt like it was important to write that chapter specifically. I wrote about the police, wrote about the protests, like wrote about a host of things. It was my attempt to think about the most important stories and experiences I've had over the past couple of years and what were the lessons I got from them. I wanted to share that.
What was the hardest chapter to write?
I think writing about identity, just because, you know, I talk about the police all the time. I talk about the protests all the time. Like, those things are easy. I just had never really written about identity and what it meant to be a gay Black man and how I process that. I just, like, hadn't written about it before, so I had to find the words to put on paper, where some of the other stuff, I've talked about it a million times. I just needed to, like, put the pen down.
So let's go back to the beginning of your activism as we've seen it, which was Ferguson. And I always wonder, because you've been such a leader for so many years, I always wonder like how an activist is born. And what I learned is that it was just like anybody at home watching the protests on television, and you just decided to act. So can you kind of take people through those moments of the early days of Ferguson and why you just couldn't stay away?
Yeah, I think that is actually how all activism works. Like, the first thing I ever did in Ferguson, I made the most amazing sandwiches in somebody's kitchen. That was like what I did, and a lot of us, like, that's how we started. We were like in this kitchen, we made like dope sandwiches because people were hungry, and like that was how most organizing starts, with people being like, I think something's wrong, I think we should talk about it, let's try and do something. You didn't see all the things we did that like didn't resonate. You only saw the things that took off. But I was sitting on my couch on August 16th, Mike got killed on the 9th, and I was like, I'm gonna go to St. Louis. I'm gonna go see if I can like figure out what happened just for myself. And I got tear gas the second night I was in St. Louis, and I was like, this is wild, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure that nobody else has to experience that. You know, we were in the street for 400 days. People forget that it was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014. So if you saw us marching, it wasn't that we thought marching was like a dope thing to do. It was literally, if we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. So it's one of the reasons why I continue wearing this vest specifically, is that I've been in it since the protests, and like I never want to forget that the things we lived through are real. You know, I can go to enough places, I can be in cool places like this, and like you just can forget a little bit. It's like I never want to forget what it was like to hide under my steering wheel as a SWAT cars drove down the street. That was so wild to me, and a reminder of how fragile freedom is.
Well, and especially once you start getting attention and people are writing pieces about you, I think it would be really easy to get caught up in that part of it, but like you said, wearing that vest. And I don't think I realized that it was that long, that you had to face the elements and that this was part of your armor, really.
Yeah, and I was one of many people. You know, I'm proud to say that there were so many people on the street, right? There were so many people leading in different ways. There were people who led the actions. There were people who were strategists. You know, one of my roles was to tell the truth and like use the platforms to get people to go places and move people. There were the live streamers. You think about back in 2014, there was no Facebook Live, there was no Twitter video, there was no Periscope. We were using Vine, like the best of them. We were literally like take a video, then we run back and we like hold the phone up to our ear to like listen to the best 6 seconds, and then we press send. Like we had a whole strategy for how to use Vine, you know? And now Vine is like, you know, some people don't even know what Vine is. But it was like a special time. But it was incredible to be a part of a community of people who were willing to risk it all because we knew we were on the right side of justice.
And you mentioned how different it was versus in previous decades because of Twitter, because you were able to tell your own stories. And you actually say that Twitter kind of helped to save your lives.
Yeah, in no uncertain terms, did Twitter saved our lives. That, you know, the first city that you ever saw aerial footage of was Baltimore, because in St. Louis there was a no-fly zone declared almost immediately. So if we had not been the people with pictures and videos, like you wouldn't have seen anything. Missouri would have tried to convince you that we didn't exist. So Twitter like was the thing that really did save our lives. And you know, I'm not naive. I've seen the best and worst of Twitter. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for trying to raise money to get me killed. So I've seen that version of it. I've also seen the power of it to like help people tell stories and build community that otherwise wouldn't be able to. So that has been transformative for me.
And you've really used your Twitter. I've been following you for years on your Twitter, and just whether you're giving motivational words, whether you're exposing something, whether it's saying, I love my Blackness and yours too, how important is that tool for you?
It is, you know, it's different, a little different today, because I'm not convinced that we're designed to get as much feedback as the platform provides. Like, you know, one of the beautiful things about being in protest and the first wave of protests is that it was like tunnel vision. We were just like focused on the stuff ahead of us. I didn't realize the world was watching us until I went home when Freddie Gray got killed. Like, I just had no clue. And the tunnel vision was actually great, because it was like people could say whatever they want. I didn't know, you know, whatever. Now it's like I say something random, and people are like, did it? And you're like, I don't even, what did I do? You know, I woke up one day and I was getting tagged and all this stuff on Facebook, and it's like, I actually haven't said anything. I'm like, what happened? And somebody has this whole thread. They're like, Beyonce likes DeRay, and Beyonce is sponsored by this oil company. And you're like, what is, like, where'd that even come from? You're like, I don't even understand. So that is not exciting. Sometimes you're just like, or even like Spotify. I love Discover Weekly. I'm a big fan of Discover Weekly. Shout out to Spotify. I don't get paid to say that. I just like really like Discover Weekly. And it got so, I would tweet every Monday about my new playlist because I loved it. It was so wild that people, like a reporter started calling Spotify to get a statement about whether they paid me or not. So I know the PR team at Spotify because they called me being like, just so you know, we're getting a lot of requests. And you're like, why, right? Like I didn't do anything. So.
And you're like, do I still need to pay for premium, or can we
I
just?
know, I'm like, is there a discount?
We're
I
helping
did
each
meet
other.
the Discover Weekly team though, because I tweeted about them so much and they were dope.
So let's get into the book a little bit. The subtitle here says The Case for Hope, and you really open up sort of comparing the difference between faith and hope. And despite how negative things feel, hope is something that you're still really passionate about and you're holding on to.
I think that hope is our fuel. You know, when I think about when King says things like the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, that's about faith. What I would say that's a hope statement is that the moral arc bends because we bend it. And that is a statement about hope, and I believe that. You know, when we say that the system is, broken and people say it's designed to be this way, they're like, no, it's working like how it's designed. My takeaway from that is that it was designed. Like people made this up, and because people made it up, we can make something different. And that to me is hope. Hope isn't magic, hope is real work. And I think about all the people who are like in the street, all the people running for office, all the people challenging systems and structures. They are people who know that this world is not the best version of it, that we can like make something better.
Which is why Make America Great Again is so frustrating.
And dangerous. You know, America wasn't great to my great-grandmother who picked cotton for pennies on the bale. It wasn't great to the people who swung from trees, right? Like that language is about using nostalgia and trying to take us back to America that people like me and you survived, right? Our people survived that time. We don't want to go back to that. The hard part about the left is that we're trying to usher people into a time and a place that we've never seen before. We've never lived in a world where everybody can read and write and everybody has food and shelter. That is new. We're trying to paint and imagine something that hasn't existed. And I write in the book that like, imagination is one of our biggest tools. If you can't imagine it, you can't fight for it. That has to be a key part of our work.
Has there been a time where you've lost hope?
No, my hope is pretty constant. There's been a time where my faith has been challenged, but like my hope is pretty steady.
One chapter in the book that really got me was the whole section on police and policing and what that means. And you sort of compare it to a glass with holes in it, and that it is just like fundamentally broken.
It's just done.
What to you are the maybe top two, I know there's so many, top two issues with policing that we can fix that are very easy to address?
Yeah, so what we didn't know in 2014 that we know today is that there literally is just a different system of justice for the police, that they play by different rules. So I write about in the book that in California, there's a law that says that any any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline, regardless of the finding. That just doesn't make sense. In Cleveland, they destroy police officer disciplinary records every 2 years. That just doesn't make sense, you know? In Baltimore, in Maryland, the law literally says you can make an anonymous complaint against officers for everything except brutality. That is like literally what it says. And you're like, well, that doesn't really make sense, right? So there are all these things that almost guarantee that officers won't be held accountable. And the data is sort of wild. 1 in 11 gun homicides in California is committed by an officer. A third of all the people killed by strangers killed by an officer. So those things are real challenges. I'll ask you a question. Tell me something you can buy for $300.
A bicycle.
A bicycle. In Florida, to this day, theft over $300 is a felony. And when you become a felon in Florida, you permanently lose the right to vote. That is wild, right? But when we ask people what's a felon, they're like, oh, people killed 10 people. And you're like, nope, he stole a bike when he was 18 and literally can't vote. 2 million people in the state of Florida can't vote because they're ex-felons. And like, that is how mass incarceration becomes the mass, right? Like, it's those little things that people don't think about that actually aren't little in practice. In Oklahoma, up until 2001, theft over $50 was a felony. You're like, well, that is, you know, everybody's a felon. I'm probably a felon. I probably stole something from the grocery store by mistake. That was over $50, right?
I'm constantly walking out of the grocery store with a bottle, and I'm like, oh, crap, I didn't pay for this.
Constantly? I don't know about that.
No, not constantly. Not constantly.
I don't know about constantly.
It's like, it's happened.
Okay.
It's happened.
Constantly.
What you said in California was the thing that stuck out to me the most, where the investigation, if it lasts longer than a year, but the police are the ones doing the investigation, so they can stretch out the investigation until, and then they're like, so we didn't solve it. So.
I think this is common sense, right? Like, people try and paint the movement protesters is these sort of like extremists. And it's like, you tell me why we destroy police officer disciplinary records. Like, give me a good example. Give me a good reason. I've not heard anything that compels me. You know, as I used to be the chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore, and if I had proposed that we just delete teacher disciplinary records, parents would be up in arms. They'd be like, what you mean we deleting the records, right? But the police, you're just like, you know, the other thing that's interesting about the police is that it is so deeply seeded into our culture that the police can do whatever they want. So have you seen Zootopia by any chance? So in Zootopia, the rabbit is like the lead. She's like the lead police officer. There's a point where somebody steals something like random, and she's just like running roughshod through people's neighborhoods. There's like that little miniature neighborhood. She's just like knocking people over. And you're like, why is it okay that it's like you can just do whatever you want? Bright, that not great movie on Netflix. First scene is like, they're like, the police officers are going to a bodega, and they're just like knocking people over. Bad boys, they're like shooting in the crowds. You're like, we have to challenge this imagery that like the police can just do whatever they want at all costs in the name of justice. Like, that actually doesn't make sense.
That takes me to use of force. And I just kind of naively assumed that there was this general rule on use of force across the nation and that police departments had to abide by it. But it really is precinct by precinct. They determine what is a use of force, what isn't. And you in the book, you kind of take certain cities that have really tightened that, and they've seen less police fatalities.
Yeah, so we did the first ever public database of police union contracts and use of force policies. Use of force policies are rules that allow people, the police, to use force up to deadly force. And there are things that like are wonky. So in New York City, chokeholds are banned. Eric Garner got killed. You saw the video. The NYPD said that Eric Garner was not put in a chokehold. He was put in a stranglehold. And strangleholds are not banned in New York City. What is the difference? A chokehold restricts your airway, and a stranglehold restricts like an artery. And you're like, the difference is like one little hair of your arm, right? Like, that actually is sort of shady. There are other cities where you can shoot into moving vehicles. You're like, you know, there are very few circumstances where like shooting into a moving vehicle makes sense. You kill somebody who's driving and the car, you know, it doesn't just stop because they died. Like, people's feet tense up and like they just keep going into crowds. Like, that actually, there are all these things that we wanted to research. You know, there are rules that we think are good that require officers to give a warning before they draw their gun. You know, we even advocate for an officer have to report every time they draw their gun, because like you shouldn't be just like drawing every time you draw your gun. It should be like a big deal, because like you shouldn't be just walking through the neighborhood being like, put your hands up. Like, that's wild, you know? So there are a lot of things that we didn't even know were issues until we did this big research.
Yeah, it's called Campaign Zero, right? The
Campaign
database
Zero.
that you put together, and
Yep.
it was looking at, because before this, there was no record of police fatalities, right?
So there were some incredible databases that existed before we made this big one. So Kill by Police and Fatal Encounters were the two that that like did a lot of really good work. And most people know the Washington Post database. The challenge with the Post database, which is probably the most well-known publicly, is that it only includes on-duty killings that use guns. So say, for example, an officer goes home and shoots his wife, that's not included because it was off duty. Say an officer is on duty and runs somebody over with their car, not included, right? So we would say that, like, you know, those things should be in the database. Eric Garner's not in the database because Eric Garner wasn't killed with a gun, right? And we would say that we should talk about all forms of violence, not just ones that use guns. But we wanted to make this database because there were so many holes in the data. And the wildest thing is if you get killed in this country by an officer, and it's not reported in a newspaper, then you don't exist in the data set. The federal government does not collect the data. So we can tell you the rainfall in Missouri in 1830, but can't tell you how many people got killed last year or last month. There are whole years where the state of Florida has reported 0 killings by police. We know that's not true, right? Like, that's just like, look at the news and you know that's not true. So I'm hopeful that the federal government soon will do something. Obama was interested, like he had pushed the DOJ to start doing it, but in this administration, you know, we're just trying to, this is like, the federal government exists by like tape at this point. So
You mentioned Obama, and you talk about your meetings with politicians in the book, and how conflicting that can be because you're challenging the political structure, but you also need them to help you. And you also say that you didn't always agree with what these politicians believed. So how do you balance that? Because I know people could criticize you for taking certain meetings, but you also have a bigger agenda.
people certainly criticize us for taking the meetings. You know, we understand that part of our role as protesters, that protesters telling the truth in public. And part of our commitment is to take the truth with us everywhere we go. So we take it to the White House, we take it to the streets, we take it to the boardrooms, we take it to platforms like this. So when we sat across from Obama, the second meeting, I had just gotten out of jail in Baton Rouge. I was in jail for 17 hours. Louisiana has this sort of wild law that when you get out of jail, the judge has to give you the right to leave the state. And I got on a Sunday, like the judge like came out from church to sign us out. And she forgot to check out the box, so I'm like stuck in Louisiana for another day because we got to wait for her to come back to the office. So by the time I get to the White House, I'm like mad, right? Like the police took my book bag. They said they lost it. I never got it back. So I go in and I'm like just mad, you know, like the FBI had just visited my house. And part of our commitment was like, you know, there are a lot of people in the room who are like, thank you so much, President Obama. And I'm like, I don't have nothing to say thank you for, right? Like I got put in this cell for 17 hours. I didn't do anything wrong. And we're here to tell you that, like, the federal government can do these things. You can do it, Obama. Like, and here is our push to you, right? Because he understood that his role, he was the president, right? And, like, part of our challenge to him was, like, we need you to show up in this way. And that's what we took in every room that we were in with Bernie, Hillary, mayors, police chiefs. Like, we're here to push you and challenge you to do the best work.
So why aren't they doing the best work? What do you think has their hands tied to really push forward some change?
I think that the police have actually done an incredible job creating this narrative that to increase accountability in policing will harm communities. That's sort of like this thing. They're the only sort of union and group of public servants that, like, the moment you're like, oh, we got to do something about the police, they're like, well, neighborhood's going to be bad. And it's like, the reality is in places like Baltimore, we spend $500 million on the police department. They clear almost no cases. The FBI just came in and indicted an entire division of the police department. And the DOJ just came down and said that, like, it's a racist police department engaged in civil criminal acts, you know? Like, so I don't know if the investment in the money is actually paying off there too, but still people are so, like, afraid to criticize the police or say that the institution just could be better if we need the police at all.
And you ran for mayor of Baltimore.
I
Is
did.
that something that you would consider doing again?
Yeah, you know, I think that people have to be as organized on the inside as they are on the outside, that has to be a part of the work, that we can't just be people challenging and fighting the people on the inside. We have to be those people. I was most recently the chief human capital in the school system, and, you know, people didn't have to come to me and fight me about diversity or equity. I already believed it, right? And that was important because we could just move work really quickly because, like, I was already on the side of justice, and that has to be part of our work. You know, in 2016 when I ran, people called me a sellout for wanting to be a part of the system. It was like, how dare you? You know, BuzzFeed ran a national news story being like, DeRay Mckesson holds fundraiser in New York, as if that was like a scandal, you know? Now it's like everybody's running. If you don't run for office, you don't care, right? Most people have probably donated to campaigns that don't exist in their district or town. There's like a different way that people think about it because when, during the election with Trump, you know, I remember people telling me, they're like, DeRay, the president doesn't matter. Why would you waste your vote? Like, I remember when I publicly supported Hillary in the Washington Post, people were like, you're being dramatic. She's obviously gonna win. And they were wrong. You know, it's like, that wasn't right. But now people realize, like, the president actually has a lot of power. So you see people like, you see Ocasio-Cortez, you see Gillum, you see Stacey Abrams, you see Ayanna Pressley. You see people really challenging the way that we think about what it means to be in office.
Ayanna Pressley's video when she learned that she won
It was great.
ugh. I mean, activism is so tied to politics right now. Like you meant, like it's just
Yeah,
it's
Amy
interesting.
Sawyer in Memphis. There are a lot of people. Bruce Franks in St. Louis. Like a lot of people have understood that like we actually have to be the people in the seats of power too. And one of the ways that the status quo like maintains its hold is by trying to convince you that you have no power, right? It's the same people. They vote in every single election. They telling you your vote don't matter, right? But they there early and they got it in. And like we have to recognize that and say that like no, we're gonna play the game too.
Before we go to questions, I wanted to touch on the topic of whiteness, which you go into pretty deeply. I'm from the Midwest, and so reading this passage, I really related to. And we have this word white privilege now, which we didn't have before, and it's nice to be able to put a label on it. And we have a lot of allies, but you talk about allyship not really being enough, and that we need accomplices. And I thought that was really powerful. So can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we think about allies love you from a distance. They're like, hope you get free, got you, like, good job. Accomplices love you up close. So this idea of like, it's one thing to acknowledge your privilege and say like, I get it. I benefit from like, as a white person, that they benefit from something that is structural and that is not fair and not right. It's another thing to take that awareness and say like, let me figure out what the structural piece is that even allows me to have this privilege and let me do my part to dismantle it. Because white people, the system just responds differently to white people. I think about being in the street is that there'd be nights where white people would be on the front line because they knew that the police just wouldn't grab them. I'll never forget this one night in Ferguson. We're at the police department, and literally she's like 65, and she's like blocking the street, white woman. And the police officer literally walks over, like grabs her arm really kindly, walks her across. I'm like, you just walked her across the street. If that was me, you'd have like body slammed me. You know, I'd be in the hospital. But it was powerful to see people like use their privilege and say like, I'm actually implicated in this right now, and that's what accomplices do.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful message of action. And it actually helped me, I think, in conversations with people in my life. They'll ask me what they can do, and you kind of gave me a language for what can kind of help the broader movement. So I thought that was really powerful. I think it's now a good time to go to the audience. We have a couple of questions.
Hi. Okay.
Hello.
I was wondering, what do you think is the best way to educate white people or non-people of color on police brutality, white privilege, without them feeling personally attacked about it?
Yeah, sometimes some of the best thing that we can do is ask the really thoughtful question that I think you've probably been in a situation where you're preaching inadvertently, that somebody says something and you're like, that's not right. And then you give this like really intense speech and they're like, I don't know. And then you give another speech and they're like, I don't know. And then so you've given like 5 speeches, they've done nothing, and then they're not convinced, right? So some of the best stuff that we can do is like really challenge people. So people ask me all the time, they'll be like, you know, DeRay, do you think that should the police never kill people, right? Like, you know, and I say to them, like, tell me when the police should kill your child, right? Like, help me, like, you name all the instances where somebody you love, if they do something, like, what are those things that would allow them to be killed and you'd be okay with it? And like, that is like a legitimate question, right? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, well, I don't know either, right? Like, part of that is like, how do we put the cognitive burden on other people so we're not the only people sort of thinking deeply in this work? That some of what you can do to confront is really challenge people to do the thinking on their own. I think about white privilege, we can do that. Like, do you think you benefit from something that other people don't? Like, ask the open-ended question and guide people there as opposed to like preaching mode, if not only because you get exhausted. You've given like 18,000 great responses. They're like, I don't know. And you're like, that's not it. Yeah.
Or they can just read the chapter in his book.
It's called The Choreography of Whiteness. Boom.
I'm not even joking. I mean, it's like, just read this. Just pass it along. Yeah. Next question.
Hi, my name is Runa Ray. I'm a doctor here in New York City, and I've seen a lot of the racism in the health system here, and of course, you know, we see it in the criminal justice system, and I do a lot of activism on Medicare for All and the New York Health Act, in part because I really believe in, you know, guaranteed access to care for everyone. So my question for you is, if everyone's needs were met, and in particular, if people had access to health care, especially mental health care, what impact do you think that would have on racial justice, and in particular, racism in the criminal justice system? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that I'm sensitive to the healthcare piece. When I was in human capital in the school system, I managed the healthcare for the school district, right? We had 20,000 subscribers. We had a great plan. And it was a reminder to me that access is not always enough when quality suffers. And then the sort of access can sometimes be like an overwhelmed system, right? So like, I think about a number of people in our district who like, hey, we had great health care. They could never get an appointment, right? But they technically had access, right? So I think that the access is like the bare requirement that people should have coverage and people should be able to like should be able to get service when they need it. But the quality thing is really like a real issue when we think about low-income communities. I think about in Baltimore, we had all these mobility issues, and it was like, well, how do we have people walk when they don't feel safe in the neighborhood, right? And like that is like a real thing we need to think about. When we think about HIV testing, we're a city where a lot of people have HIV. And it's like, how do we get people tested? And one of the things that we found out is that people didn't want to get tested because it's a relatively small city. So some of the testing facilities, they might know somebody who works there, right? So it was like, how do we actually navigate these things? It wasn't that they didn't believe in their health. It wasn't that they didn't care about the results. It was that they wanted it to be private, right? And like, how do we make those things is like a matter of public policy? And like, I think that's interesting. And like, how do we talk about healthcare beyond hospitals, right? So much of the way we talk about healthcare is about like how hospitals function, but we know that so much of healthcare is actually how you live every day, how you eat, how you exercise. So that's what I'm interested in when we think about the health conversation, that like, you're right, like people need access. I think about access as like the bare minimum.
And we have one more question.
Hi. You've had a very lengthy career in activism, and I'm just wondering if there's any stories that you have that maybe don't fit within the book, but you still feel are like important to share.
Yeah, a lot. I don't think lengthy. I hope that I hope that one day we win, so I can like go teach again, and like I'm not fighting the system all day. There are a lot of stories. I think about, I didn't write about Baton Rouge, and I was in Baton Rouge because an activist reached out. I just got a job as the chief human capital. Activists reach out, was like, DeRay, will you come to Baton Rouge? I was like, I got it, I'll come down. So I go down and I'm in the street for like, I don't know, 5 hours. The police, and I just got in this job and I was like, I'm gonna be really low key, I'm not gonna get in trouble. Like, I just got this job, I'm trying to make no waves. So the officer's like, get out of the street. I'm like, you're right, I'm out of the street. So I'm like moving out of the street and I'm recording it and I still get arrested and I'm in custody for 17 hours. And I didn't write about that. And that was like just because it didn't fit into one of the messages I was trying to deliver. But that was sort of a wild thing. I'll never forget it. The jail in Baton Rouge is both tiny. It was 50 of us in and out of this sort of one cell, which was a nightmare. The lights are always fluorescent. There's no clock. It's like you don't really know how long you've been in. The food was like out of a bad TV. It's like, I think I'll just starve. It's fine. Like I was like, can I just get an orange? Like I don't need anything else. When I was in jail, ABC had tweeted that I was found unresponsive in a cell. So the guy on the phone was like, I'll never forget it. He like comes running back. He's like, Mckesson. And I'm like, hey, he's like, you're not dead. I'm like, not dead. So it was just like that was a long process. And we sued. I led a class action lawsuit to sue the Baton Rouge Police Department. We won. It's the only successful class action lawsuit since the protests began. We got everybody's record expunged. We got a monetary settlement for people. We got everybody's bond paid for and all lawyer fees, right? And like we pushed for those things because we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just like a dollar amount, but that your record was cleared from this event. I've been sued by 5 officers in 2 states for like inciting a riot or something like that. And like those things are things that I still am working through. There's one lawsuit that is still active that I'm hoping will go away soon. And I didn't write about those sort of things.
When you're going through all of these trials, does your legacy ever pop in your head and what you want to be remembered for?
No, I'm hopeful that we all look back and say that we worked together to change the system, right? We have clearly won the awareness battle. We changed the conversation, done it, got it. I want to look back and say that we figured out how to make the conversation change the system. And like that is what I want our collective legacy to be. So less about me and more about that. I do the safety thing. I try not to get distracted by the issues around safety while still being mindful of them. And I've been, there's a movie theater that got evacuated because somebody tweeted and they're going to shoot me. And like those sort of things, my phone got hacked. And sometimes that is like, you're just like both annoyed and a little bit afraid. You're like, did you really hack my phone? Like what? And that was why I was on a panel once and I have 2 phones and I have one sitting in front of me and I look up and it says, please activate your phone. And I'm like, well, that's really weird. I'm going to turn it off, turn it back on. And I'm like, it's like, please activate your phone. I'm like, that's really weird. So I start texting people at Twitter being like, I think my account got hacked, maybe. And coming to find out with Verizon, your PIN number is the last 4 of your social. Like, and my social got dumped in something. So somebody called, they tried to change my phone number over the phone. Luckily, you can't do that. But they got the SIM card changed over the phone, and then they reset every account they knew that I had. So Twitter, Gmail, all this stuff. So that the 2-factor went to a device that they could control, which is how they got it. And they tweeted they tweeted like, I support Donald Trump for president. So then the other phone starts blowing up because people are like, DeRay, please tell me about your support. And I'm like, my phone got hacked, didn't support Trump, sorry about that. So those things were like really dramatic.
I remember that made national news.
It was
Yeah,
something.
it was a thing. Well, I could talk to you for another hour, but if you guys are interested in really diving more into anything we've discussed, On the Other Side of Freedom really is, I think, a necessary read and something that's going to start a lot of important conversations. So I want to thank you for writing it. I want to thank you
you.
for joining us today. Guys, give it up for DeRay Mckesson.